Good morning. I'm Reta Jo Lewis, and we would like to welcome you to a new GMF series, the Stakeholder Influence on Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity. At GMF, we're going to be embarking on a year-long discussion and conversation around strategies for building inclusive societies across all markers of diversity. Domestic policy on both sides of the Atlantic has been upended by the coronavirus pandemic. And this is added to the instability that has been accentuated by the inherent weaknesses in Western democracies grappling with longstanding needs to reverse generations of inequity and exclusion. It's clear that solutions to domestic and global concerns must involve the voices of all stakeholders. And so this dialogue conversation in this series is going to feature thought leaders, community leaders, people from the private sector, practitioners, elected officials, all in today's conversation that begins with a panel about finding new common ground. How is one building trust in relationships and advocacy across the Atlantic? So someone has said, at GMF, we want to take the programmatic work that we've been doing and push it to the next level by engaging in purposeful conversation about DE&I in the US and Europe. Race and equality are in the spotlight right now. And over the past year, the world has been witness to the death of too many people of color. And even in the pandemic, people went to the streets on both sides of the Atlantic to protest the police brutality and to show their support of renewed commitment to issues of equity and inclusion. At GMF, we're going to be expanding on our efforts that we've been doing to talk about and to continue to showcase how we have incorporated diversity and inclusion into our programs. I'll just give you highlight a couple. Our Transatlantic City Network that was formed in 2008, it focused on our sustained exchange of information about innovative policies and local policy challenges among a network of city leaders. We have a GMF signature leadership program that established the Inclusive Leaders Network. And in Paris, the network, the Transatlantic Inclusion Leaders Network program, launched in 2012, has brought together a cohort of young, diverse elected leaders who collaborate and work on advancing inclusion policies and strengthening social cohesion. The Inclusive Leaders Network has also convened forums such as Mission Critical, an exchange on inclusive leadership in the security sector. And then GMF has regularly hosted an annual forum of women of color in transatlantic leadership for distinguished women of color from all across sectors to discuss the pressing needs on foreign policy and national security. But today, we're excited to have all of you join us and a very distinguished group of speakers and our panelists. We have our own Mayor Mitch Landrieu, who is joining us this morning. The mayor is a member of our board of trustees, and he's going to be with us throughout this year-long conversation. Just briefly, he served as the 61st mayor of the city of New Orleans. He was voted the top turnaround mayor in the country, and he also served as the president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. And then recently, he launched Pluribus Unum Fund, an organization created in the South to fulfill America's promise of justice and opportunity for all by breaking down the barriers that divide us by race and class. So, Mr. Mayor, the floor is yours, and we're delighted that you're here with us.
Reta Jo, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And it's so great to be with all of you this morning, folks in the United States, and of course, with our transatlantic partners. I'm thrilled to be here on behalf of the German Marshall Fund Board, representing the board, and also our executive director, Karen Donfried. And of course, with you, Reta Jo, who's been such an incredible leader in the United States of America and the Transatlantic Alliance. When you began your conversation, it just occurred to me that all of us are in many ways in the same boat, whether we're here or whether we're overseas, listening in Brussels and in other places. They have so many forces in the world right now that are pulling us apart, that are trying to make sure that people actually don't get together. The name of my organization is Pluribus Unum, It is one of our nation's founding mottos, but it just as well applies any place in the world. Out of many, we are one. The theory is that we're all better together. And of course, as we have seen, not just with the rise of President Trump, which I think was as much a symptom as anything else, there are forces throughout the world that are pushing a notion of nationalism, a notion of isolationism, a notion of white supremacy. All of those things are antithetical to the things that we're here to talk about today: inclusion, equity, and diversity. They're actually two different views of how the world should work. I believe that diversity, equity, inclusion is based in our history, if we could ever remember our total history. And I say that to you because for those of you that are not stateside, there are a number of different state legislatures that are in session right now, where it's shocking how many, particularly white men, are standing up and reciting a history that never was. It used to be that we could rely on facts, that there were facts and that there were lies, there was good, there was evil, there was a lot of gray in between. But now, for some reason, people are having a very difficult time actually thinking about what our real history is, even in the United States or in other places. And that's a good place for us to start, for people to educate themselves about where the world has been, where the world wants to go, how we're going to get there, and whether or not we could actually do it at each other's throats. And of course, this is what is at the heart of the movement for intentional diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to begin to really help people figure out exactly how to do that. The demographics in the United States are changing dramatically. They're changing all over the world. Power structures are changing. Who is leading, who is following, who's putting in, who's taking out. Having it in a community where everybody's ideas, everybody is welcome, where everybody can have a chance for opportunity and responsibility, I believe, is the recipe for great success and a great future. I think nationalism, isolationism, white supremacy, this notion somehow that some of us are better than others simply because of the color of our skin, which, as you know, is it's really a made up thing, is not a good way to move in the United States of America. I served as the mayor of one of the country's cities. On the ground in real time, you're dealing with human beings, many of whom are trying to share space. They're trying to share resources. Technology shifts, economic shifts, immigration, global warming, trade, the pandemic, all of these things are stressing people out. And it's easy to find enemies with people who don't look like you until you begin to really understand that our interests are very much the same and very much common. And so Pluribus Unum, the organization that I started, is designed to try to find a way to get to our civic organizations, to get to the government, to get to the faith-based community, and to recommit ourselves in the United States of America to the promise that we made to each other when we first came here, which is that we all come to the table of democracy as equals. Clearly, historically, that has just been an aspiration. We have not yet perfected that very important and that very brilliant idea. And of course, this last year, as though we didn't have enough history already, this last year with the killing of George Floyd, the police-involved shootings, all of the inequities that we have seen, the disparate impact that COVID has had on people of color, it continues to demonstrate, in my opinion, that we actually have some system design problems in the United States of America. And I'm sure this is true in the Transatlantic Alliance as well, where many of our institutions were designed either with malignant intent or benign neglect. And today, it's pretty clear that those institutions, given the way that they were designed, have created a disparate impact, have created income inequality, have created lack of opportunity, and as a consequence, not only have hurt the people who have been cut out, but have hurt the rest of us because not everybody is participating. I will say a couple of things about this. Number one, race is a very difficult thing for people to talk about. We actually don't do it very well in the United States of America. We have looked across the seas to Germany and the issue of truth and reconciliation. We've looked to South Africa. But quite frankly, the people of the United States of America are not good at this. We don't know how to do it, and we have to learn how to do it. But let me be clear about this. I believe that it's a time for choosing in our country. I think that we can only go forward together. And I don't think if we decide not to do it together, I don't think we're going to move forward. I don't think we're going to get much better. This last week, there's been a fairly intense discussion. Senator Tim Scott gave the rejoinder to President Biden's speech to the country, where he said America is not a racist nation. And it started off a fairly broad conversation about whether we are or whether we're not. What actually that feels like And it begins, to focus your attention on, well, how many people in the country have to be racist for us to become a racist country? Is the country itself racist or just a couple of people? What is racism? What does it look like? How does it manifest itself? How is it undone? Is it implicit? Is it overt? And it actually started in a very aggressive way, a conversation that this country really needs to think about deeply. And then we have to come up with a system for all of us to have that conversation inside our not-for-profits, inside of our larger businesses, inside of our governments. And I will say this, the issue of racism in America is our Achilles heel. The reason it's raw is because it's a wound that has never healed. I don't think that you can go around this or over it. I think you have to go through it. And I think that you have to begin to understand that system design is one of the critically important focal points of everybody's actions going forward. It's not just a public sector issue. This is something that's going to have to be dealt with in the private sector and the not-for-profit sector as well. And then I'll finally say this. As we think about how we figure out what our real truth is, and then we think about moving towards reconciliation, it's very, very difficult for us to move into a phase of reconciliation unless and until there's an actual acknowledgement and a step towards some level of atonement. I don't think that you can have cheap grace as it relates to race. And I think that America is going to have to go through the painful experience of really understanding her full past, understanding what her potential is, acknowledging what our transgressions have been, and then making a commitment to go forward together, because I believe it's been proven, I don't think it's very refutable, although many people are trying to, that diversity is in fact our greatest strength. It's not our weakness. There are many people who don't believe or agree with what I just said. That debate has to be had. I think history will judge that we're on the right side of history, but we have to start someplace, and you have to start, in my opinion, with one step at a time. That's why I'm really thrilled that the German Marshall Fund has really engaged in this year-long discussion. And Reta Jo, I want to thank you for helping to lead this effort. GMF thinks that it's really an important role for them to play in this particular space, because as we think about our Transatlantic Alliance, we completely understand that we're not in this alone. This is not just an issue for the United States of America, but it is an issue that has plagued the world from time immemorial. So we're here. We're looking forward to the discussion. I can't wait to hear what the panel has to say, and I look forward to the year-long colloquy on this most important issue. Reta Jo, thank you very much.
Mr. Mayor, thank you so much. And I just have one quick question before we let you get away. You were the mayor during Katrina and doing the BP oil spill. And now with your new organization, we'd just like for you to just add just a couple of comments about what do you think the new civic architecture looks like when societies are seeking and finding common ground, and why is it important for global organizations like GMF and yours to be in this dialogue at this time?
Well, thank you. That's a great question, and I thank you for it. A couple things. Just because somebody terms themselves a global organization or a national organization, it doesn't mean that you have to be far away from the ground. Lots of times we have these disconnects when many of us sit way up here. I'm way up here. I'm thinking Washington, D.C., as opposed to having your feet on the ground in a particular community, county, or town in the United States of America. And I think every organization has to make sure that wherever they are and whatever they're doing, the C-suite has to touch the ground. That's critically important. There has to be complete and total connection between what is being set up here and what is happening on the ground, because it is mostly disconnected. And when you're creating something up here, by the time it gets to the ground, it is very different. And so whatever structure you need to set up in your organizations to make sure that you, as we like to say in my neighborhood, if you're going to talk the talk, you need to walk the walk. The second thing is this: cross system collaboration is critically important. When I was mayor of the city, I couldn't have gotten anything done just with the government itself. We had to make sure that the faith-based community was at the table, the civic organizations, the not-for-profits. We had to make sure that on the government level, we were coordinating with the federal, state, and local officials. And of course, we had to deal with the community organizations that were actually on the ground. The third thing is this: with technology being as robust as it is now, information is moving at rapid paces. And it's really important in this regard to hold the center. And what I mean by that is not the ideological center, but the gravamen of the weight around the conversation should not be dictated by the extremes. It can be informed by the extremes, but it should not be dictated by the extremes. And I think people have to be very careful about what they happen to be hearing across social media and discern as leaders whether what you're hearing is a few people yelling loudly or a lot of people speaking lowly. A lot of people speaking lowly is a movement. A couple of people speaking loudly is just noise. And I think as leaders, it's important for us to discern what that is. And then finally, I just, there's black and white and then there's gray. I get that. But on the issue of race and on the issue of diversity, on the issue of inclusion and inequity, I just passionately believe that that is the right way forward. And I say that clearly and overtly because amazingly, not everybody agrees with that. There are actually people that are pushing us towards nationalism and isolationism and nativism. That is wrong. That is bad for the world. It's bad for the United States of America. It's bad for our alliances. That's why we have a thing called the Transatlantic Alliance. Everybody knows that you have to have a certain level of enlightened self-interest, but it's also true that you can't get a whole lot done on your own. And that's true about individuals, it's true about families, and it is clearly true about nations. It's clearly true about the world community. And so I believe that in this moment, you have to put a stake in the ground because this is a time for choosing. For whatever reason, this moment has hit us. It is an inflection point. We can go one way or we can go in the opposite way. And it's almost the either or. It's not a both and in this situation. And I think it's critically important that all of us in the transatlantic community make a commitment to making sure that everybody's included, that if we don't go forward together, we can't go forward at all, because essentially that's not just an aspiration, that's a fact and a truth. It's just not going to work if all of us are not taking equal opportunity and equal responsibility. And as mayor of the city of New Orleans, I tried to govern that way. And as I've traveled around the country, I've come to believe more in that theory of going forward than I did even when I was serving in capacity as the president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors or mayor of the city of New Orleans itself.
You know, Mitch, we just want to say thank you so much for joining us and kicking us off this morning. We appreciate you being with us and hearing and listening to your remarks. This tells us that we are on the right path for intentional conversation, as you said. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Reta, Joe. Thank all you guys. Good luck to you. I can't wait to hear you.
Thank you. You know, we're going to move to someone who we are just so exceptionally proud of at the German Marshall Fund. You know, Tonya Allen is a 2016 Marshall Memorial Fellow. But right now, just recently, Tonya became the president of the McKnight Foundation. You know, it's a Minnesota-based foundation, but not only as the president, she is an advisor to numerous corporations regarding inclusion efforts and was named in Crain's Detroit Business 100 Most Influential Women. You know, as someone, Tonya, who has been a champion of diversity and inclusion and equity, you've been driven by passion. And right now, you are currently living in Minnesota, the center of racial reckoning since the murder of George Floyd occurred in Minneapolis. So Tonya, with all of the uniqueness of the experience that you bring, someone who has traveled globally and throughout Europe with us and in your other capacities, you have such a unique perspective, and we don't think anyone is better positioned as a stakeholder to have this conversation with us. And so Tonya, I want to turn the floor over to you and say welcome.
Oh, thank you so much, Reta, Joe. And it was wonderful to hear Mayor Landrieu. And so I want to just express my gratitude to the German Marshall Fund for lifting this important issue. So as you noted, I spent the majority of my career in the comfort of my hometown of Detroit, working on local and national issues related to making the American dream an American reality. The possibility of everyone having access to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the possibility of access to opportunity that will allow them to grow their economic status and care for their families and not worry about basic needs like quality housing, having enough food, or even the freedom of self-determination. So as a Black woman in the US, I know the historical record of this country. Unfortunately, the country has yet to reckon with it. The United States of America has conveniently forgotten its role of establishing a racialized hierarchy that has kind of concentrated and centered whiteness at the expense of everyone else. Now, we have seen this with the indigenous tribal people who populated the land. We saw it with enslaved Africans who provided free labor that really grew the global trade system that financed America's independence, as well as its economic dominance in its formative years. And we also saw it with our immigrants that came to this country looking for a better life. That includes the European ethnics who were severely discriminated against before they became white, as well as the newer and more colorful migrants who are in our country who are not as easily absorbed or into the fabled American melting pot. But then last year, I would just say America began to remember. And this remembrance and reckoning was uniquely tied to the death of George Floyd. There was nothing particularly novel about George Floyd's death. Black men have been killed by law enforcement indiscriminately in the United States for a very long time. The major difference is that the world had slowed to a crawl as a result of the pandemic. And in that quiet moment when our attention was captured, we saw the realities of inequity, systemic racism, and the hierarchy of human value displayed in a video capturing 9 minutes of heinous disregard for Floyd's life. This video was so powerful that it captured the contradictions of our nation and moved people to be different and do differently. For me, it moved me from the comfort of my hometown of Detroit, which I describe as cold, to Minneapolis, which I now refer to as the coldest, to help transform this moment of intense pain into purpose, not just for the Twin Cities region, but for America and for global relations. It moved indifferent people who benefited from racialized policies and systems and benefits to own their privilege and to own their historic stubborn apathy and newfound responsibility regarding how people who aren't white are treated. It has reinvigorated this call for diversity, inclusion, and equity. Diversity is when you count the people. Inclusion is when the people count. And equity is when the outcomes count. And you can no longer find differences based on race, ethnicity, gender, zip code, and the places you were born, or even your sexual identity. It has also revived why diversity and inclusion and equity are important in our transatlantic and global relations. It wasn't just America who saw this atrocity. It was the world who watched, as we all know. And they saw the contradictions of our nation laid bare. They know that these inconsistencies exist and were confused, quite honestly, why Americans couldn't see them. In this moment, it's important to me that America acknowledge that systemic racism is not just about how Black and Brown people are harmed by these practices, but it's also about how white people are harmed by these practices in our country, as well as Western democracies. The lack of diversity, inclusion, and equity is markedly decreasing our ability to be considered credible in our democracy or our global positions. It decreases our ability to wrestle thoughtfully with issues, as Mayor Landrieu said, nativism, nationalism, isolationism, and economic nostalgia that's taking root in the US as well as across Europe. It makes us blind to the demand for us to be more adept at diversity, inclusion, and equity as the climate chaos in our world is forcing people to move and is making our borders more porous as people seek safe haven in Western democracies. This will influence the demographics of the EU and America, which will require Western nations to become adept at managing diversity, inclusion, and equity if we want strong democracies and successful economic as well as technological transitions. And it's going to require us to be good diplomats. Our situations are becoming so bleak that we lose the ability to see the wins and gains in our collective actions and not just in our individual pursuits. And these times require us to admit that we don't know how to do this, that we have to build a robust practice that is rooted in the geopolitical realities of transatlantic affairs. This practice, in my opinion, must acknowledge that diversity, inclusion, and equity have to be deliberate, intentional, and exponential. Equity is a force. Equity. Thank you. Equity is a force multiplier, and that it is going to really require us to acknowledge that this work cannot be delegated. We all have to do this. We all have to be stakeholders in the work. And that means that we have to identify and animate policies, practices, and strategies that accelerate economic success. And it needs to be rooted in government policy and practice, as well as in industry, strategy, and their economic returns. We have to recognize there's more gain than there is to lose. We have to go by what I call the 70-20-10 principle. And that is on any issue, we can normally find 70%. We can find our way to 70% if we negotiate. And then there's another 20%, 70% we mostly agree on. There's another 20% that we could probably find if we really negotiate. And then there's a 10% that we never can find common ground on. And what we've seen is that we're starting with the 10%. We have to flip that around and start with 70 and work our way to 90. And then we have to be accountable. We got to track our progress through inclusion and equity metrics, and that are global, and that we find that we're going to be accountable to those numbers. And then lastly, I would just say, Reta Jo, is that we have to prepare for the blowback. This country has made progress before, and we already know that with about that 5 or 7 year mark afterwards, we get blowback, and that actually people of color do worse after the blowback. So how do we, as people of goodwill, take on this issue and prepare for durable, sustainable change that really focuses on having these competencies around diversity, inclusion, and equity that restore and strengthen democracy across the Transatlantic?
Tonya, I think you and the mayor have really set up our conversation for our panel. And I know you're in the middle of a board meeting, and we really want you to come back. I know you have a hard stop, but we really want to come back and get your perspective as we engage this next set of stakeholders about their experiences. And just want to thank you right now, momentarily, for your comments, your great comments and insights, because you really put it front and center about us working in a global perspective and how it looks to us, not just as the US, but all types of democracies. So with that, I want to thank you and welcome you back right before we closed for your own reflections of what you're hearing today from our great panel. So thank you. Absolutely. Thank you so much. I want to turn quickly to someone who has just become a visiting fellow at the German Marshall Fund. And Todd Corley is someone who I have worked with extensively, like all of you, who has worked 30 years now as a diversity expert. And he's a former corporate executive officer who was in charge of diversity and inclusion. And as a senior consultant, Todd, for numerous Fortune 500 organizations, and the architect of a landmark diversity initiative that resulted in a 626% increase in racial and equity diversity for one particular organization. And so with that, Todd, our visiting fellow, I want to turn it over to you to open it up to this great panel after the remarks that we have just had from our stakeholders, Tonya and Mitch.
Reta, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. To the mayor, thank you for your words. Tonya, your remarks were spot on and inspiring. I'm going to keep us tight on the time that we have left for today, because the more important voices today are going to be those that you hear from me, from the panelists who I'll ask to join me on camera now. And you have their bios in front of you, so I won't take time to read those, but I do want to say something about the collective group. The group that you have in front of you are people who have been in charge of organizations that have, inspired young people to deal with domestic policy issues, foreign policy issues, people who are helping build infrastructure around communities, in California and in the Eastbay, people who have been focused on work from NATO, member of parliament. We have, folks who are on the corporate side who have worked with companies in public policy, and working with civil rights commissions. So we have a number of people who have some great voices So I want to welcome to the stage so that you all hear them names formally from me. I'll toss out a question and then we'll go through those questions. But joining me today is Kendra Brown, Kolby Keo, Sachi, Yoshii, Nadja L. Fertasi, and Abena Oppong-Asare. So I have them with me for the balance of the next half hour. So thank you all for coming. Thank you so much for being here, for your time. I'm going to just chop right into it, and because we've got some great remarks so far, but I know that you can help me think through at least one question I have that I've been thinking about that I think the group would benefit from your experience on. If we think about, this notion of the common ground, which is, such a key discussion point to have when we think about not only issues of race, but all issues of diversity, whether that be sexual orientation or gender identity, religion, faith, whether it be on this side of the Atlantic or the other side of the Atlantic. The conversations are robust. They often create division, but they also create opportunities for connectedness. So my question is, and I'll maybe Kendra, I'll start with you, and then we'll go around. But the question is to start, how do communities of disparate experiences, people who have different experiences, different lived experiences, find ways to have common ground and not only practice, but in advocacy and ways of building greater community around shared objectives of equity to build a society, a complete society, versus what we hear oftentimes. I think the mayor mentioned this whole notion of tribalism that puts us in our own little pockets, in our buckets. So how do we create that community of common ground around advocacy issues versus and challenging against the wind of being very tribal and locked into who we are and not being open to people? So Kendra, I'll start with you, and then we'll go around for a few remarks on that question.
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Todd. And I thank you to the German Marshall Fund for having this conversation today. So I would say, and I will be short, I know we have amazing speakers. I would say that there really are more things that are common among us than separate us. And I think that Tonya really just did an excellent job of laying out. I love the 70-20-10 rule. I think that is absolutely spot on. And we have to start from a place of not looking at how different we are, but looking at how can we move forward in an intersectional way, right? There's so much intersectionality among many of the things that I would call the ties that bind us, right? And I oftentimes quote Dr. Martin Luther King, where he says, right, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, right? So while folks may be overseas, right, I'm still connected to them, right? Because we are part of humankind, right? And so for me, I really go at this work from a point of looking at how I can make a difference, right? And if that means that I have to see things differently, then that's how it is, right? Then that's how I need to move forward. And I think that folks should take time to see things from others' shoes, right? And from others' perspectives. And that's how we can really move forward in a united way. The digital age has connected us globally, instantaneously, right? And that is a good thing. It can be used, right, in a negative way, but at the same time, that instantaneous connection that we have to all of humankind, right, is something that can really help us to lift others. And so I think that coming from a point of looking at our commonalities instead of our differences, for me, that's the starting point.
Excellent. Kendra, thank you. Nadja, I'll go to you next from Belgium. If you could maybe answer that as well in your perspective.
Yes, thank you very much, Kendra. And I actually want to build on what you said. So I worked at NATO for 20 years, and my bread and butter was stakeholder engagement. Seek to understand before being understood. We had to negotiate and agree on very contentious topics with 30 different mindsets at different levels. So seek to understand before being understood is easier said than done. So I want to actually touch upon the human aspect, which can really be groundbreaking in how we go about this very quickly without going in too deep to it. It is, we all carry our mental model of the world, right? Which we grew up with, conscious, unconscious bias. And the brain is always guessing how to respond, how to behave, what to say, based on past experiences and based on the emotions we construct. And this is a really important thing to understand, because in every given context, we react based on what we think. And because it feels so comfortable and it's so rooted in our beliefs, what we think is very obvious to us. So what I always work on is separating fiction from facts, right? Reality testing. What do we believe, and challenging our beliefs. And the other thing is to really replace judgment with curiosity, and to lead by example, to model this behavior first self, because it is not always easy when, when emotions are heightened, when we have these national incidents or events that really go deep, as the mayor mentioned, in the wounds. So it's really important to take time and to always take perspective, to challenge our own beliefs, and to always come with intention, replace judgment with curiosity, and understand that our brain is actually a great processor and trickster, because we are only guessing, right? And especially now in the digital age, how do we build trust across the screen? To always be self-aware and of others, and to understand that everyone, almost everyone, has a positive intent, but it not always translates in that behavior. So this I would add, to really understand where does our map of the world come from, and to help foster inclusion, even for those who feel excluded, right? When people feel safe and secure within themselves, then they can you can achieve more common ground. This is what we also did at NATO.
Thank you very much. I'm going to just lift up 2 points, and I'm going to then turn the stage over to Sachi. But I heard things that our audience should remind themselves of: the conversation on intersectionality, understanding that, and where we have points of connection. But then and I'm going to quote Nadja, replacing judgment for curiosity, right? If we can do that, and we can suspend, how we judge people, but just be thoughtful and curious about who someone is, it invites us to have a little bit more unassuming and good intent, which we need a little bit more in the world. Sachi, your thoughts?
Hi, thank you, Todd. It's really interesting. I've been working in philanthropy for over 15 years, and more recently have been working closely with activist Eddie Zhang, who was formerly incarcerated for over 20 years. He now leads a foundation that's really transforming the field of philanthropy. And he shared with me that when we've truly embraced our chi, it's our culture, our history, and identity. I love that acronym. That's when we can truly understand the source of inequities, of the injustices that exist, and are able to then see our commonalities with each other. I'm a Yonsei woman, that's 4th generation Japanese American. My great-grandparents immigrated to the US over 100 years ago. My grandfather was born and raised in California. He actually celebrates his 100th birthday this year.
Wow.
And he had everything taken away from him during World War II, when our family was incarcerated. His brother lost his limbs fighting for the US. His parents lost their family restaurant here in Oakland. They raised their family in it. He grew up with a lot of Italian Americans. I think when they went to the camps, Black workers then moved into the neighborhoods. And when they came back, all they had were a few bags that they could take to camp. And they were essentially incarcerated there simply because of their race. It's only recently that my grandfather has been able to speak about this time in a much more frank way. And I am so just blessed by being able to have access to that history that so many of us just don't necessarily have access to, whether it's language, whether it's not even knowing where our history comes from. I mean, for me, I feel like that's a privilege that I carry with me today. And being able to really hear his stories about living in California, about the experiences that he's able to now share with me about what it was like coming back to the Bay Area and having everything gone and having to figure out where to live, to be in public housing, and to navigate life all over again. That is part of my culture and my identity. And being grounded in this is, has been able for, I think for me to really be able to connect in a deeper way to others who aren't necessarily able to really understand that. And for those who can, to share sort of my experience with them, to encourage and inspire finding a little bit more about ourselves in order to connect with others. So I think in many ways, that's really being able to learn more and own more about our own individual experiences, about our community's experiences, is in some ways the first step to really coming together in a greater way.
Great, then. Sachi, thank you for that story. I know it's personal, the vulnerability. We celebrate that, because I think your point is well taken, which is if we add that to the other conversations about intersectionality and judgment for curiosity, it is that sense of knowing where we started, who we are. It's almost that sense of if you don't know any of that, then you don't have context, and that's what we need to build on. So thank you. I'll invite Kolby into the on the stage for his remarks, and then I'll turn to Abena after that. Kolby.
Thank you, Todd. Thank you to the German Marshall Fund, and thank you to all the speakers so far. Sachi, I've really connected with your story. Also, someone coming from a AA and HPI background. My dad fled genocide in Cambodia to come to the United States to restart his life. And to me, I was just thinking about this the other day, I lived such a different life than he did in coming here. But I think us digging into our personal stories, to the culture, to the conflict, the challenges, certainly provides us the context in which to connect to other communities. I think it's important to acknowledge the differences, the different histories and challenges that each community has faced, because that provides us the path to better connect. If there's anything that I'm taking away so far from this morning's call is, power, so much power comes from representation. The power also comes from solidarity. And for us to, even though we're coming from different experiences, and I'm not just talking about the Black community versus the Brown community versus the AA and HPI community. If we look at AA and HPI community, it's 30 countries, over 20 Pacific Islander nations, with all distinct challenges and histories of how folks came to be here. And so that is a complex ecosystem that we can't overlook. When we are coming to the question, though, of, and I connected with Tonya's question about how do we get to durable, sustainable change? I think that's part of the reason why perhaps I'm here today as the young guy in the panel. It's to create pipelines. It's to provide opportunity to young people. Because if the common identifying factor here is that we need to be working in solidarity to provide opportunities for young people to be represented, whether from the Black community, the Brown community, or the HPI community, those opportunities have not existed. And so it's our duty as a nation, as nations, to provide a pipeline of opportunities and a pipeline to public service, a pipeline to corporate leadership. And so I think that is a commonality. That is a commonality that we seek to find, because power also is the ability to change rules, structures, and systems. But that power only comes through if we see ourselves, if we arrive at these positions. And I think this panel is exactly representative of the power that can come from when we do see people of color in those roles.
Chloe, thank you. And I'll say this, and I'm going to now then turn the stage to Abena, but I'll say this. This panel was put together, with a lot of care, a lot of thought. But many of us right now, and I should just share the audience, have met each other for the first time on screen. Some of us know each other, we have relationships and connectedness, but I say that to say that if this theme of common ground is indicative of what we're doing here right now, which is hopefully connecting with our audience. It's doable anywhere. I mean, you're giving us an hour of your time. So hopefully this sliver will give you that sense of confidence that it can be done. Abena, I'll turn the stage to you now for your thoughts.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Abena Oppong-Asare. I'm a member of Parliament from Thameslink, and I'm also a GMF alumni. So a lot of the stuff people have mentioned, I strongly agree with it. My constituency, where I represent, is a very diverse constituency. So I'm dealing with multiple kind of challenges. So I've got the white working class in some part of it. And I've also got the Black population in my constituency. To give you a bit of a background, as my constituency, we're one of the few constituencies in London that voted for Brexit. So very much different to other parts of London, working class. So that means one of the challenges that I have, particularly as a Black woman, is demonstrating to everybody that I represent their values and their voices, and that I can do that effectively with the colour of my skin, and also making sure that constituents are also represented effectively. I think language is really important in terms of how we address those issues within society. I think as a movement, particularly as politicians generally, and that includes myself in this, we've had a terrible record when it comes to speaking about issues we care passionately about. We often quote facts and figures and rely on detailed policy. And I'll give you an example of how this happened in the UK, the EU referendum, for example. From my own personal perspective, I think that more could have been done to kind of actually engage with people about their concerns. Because when people feel that they are not listened to, I think that's when you see things such as the rise of populism, and also when you stereotype people and essentially try to tell them what their views are, you alienate them a lot. I think in society, politics is changed a lot. I think, as the mayor mentioned earlier, what we've seen is the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. The sad thing about George Floyd's death is, I think in a way, it was a pivotal thing where it united not just people in America, but also in the UK and across globally. In the UK, we saw young people taken to the streets to basically march against racial inequality. And what was interesting was the narrative in terms of some people saying, well, this is an American issue. We don't have issues like the George Floyd incident and murder like we do in the UK. But, when you look at the figures in the UK, in terms of stop and search amongst Black individuals, the numbers are really high. During the pandemic, we've seen a high amount of Black individuals stopped by the police, and the data from the prosecution show that when that high amount of fines were issued to Black individuals, and when it went to prosecution, all of those fines got diminished. What we've also seen is, in terms of COVID, the inequalities have widened. Particularly those that have been impacted the most are people of colour, and these are issues that existed before COVID. And I think that we need to get to a point of actually really making sure that these issues are spoken about. And as Kolby mentioned, representation is important. Those diverse voices are important. We need to make sure that those people at the table are basically diverse as possible, making sure that people's voices are reflected. And that means that we need to get to the heart of the community in terms of making sure that their views are reflected at a top level. So as an MP, what I tend to do as a member of Parliament is, I know that people are politically engaged. They don't trust politicians. They don't feel their voices are heard. So I try to identify areas that they are congregated. And it's, during the pandemic, we've seen so many people from the community come together to provide support to people locally. So we've seen the rise of mutual aid groups. And it's so important that we're in those spaces, having conversations with people, and then you find out really what their concerns are, where their views are. You're coming from that common place, you know, you're helping in the community, you realize actually there is more in common you have with each other, and there's more in terms of you can have a language with. I think the thing that I do have concerns about is how we can reach that point, particularly on social media. In the UK, we are currently going through something called an online harm bill, which is essentially making sure, looking at how companies, technology companies can play a bigger role in addressing a lot of the misinformation that is put out on social media, because I think that's also created a rise in terms of populism. I know that people that follow me on social media, most of them already have the same views as me. So I'm not reaching out to those people that have been massively disengaged. And that means being more creative in my community to make sure I engage with people. You know, at the same time, you're also seeing people purposely spreading out like false hate. But I think the council culture is very dangerous, where I've seen a rise in that, where people are using like, you're cancelled because you said something that has been offensive. I think we also need to give people the opportunity to learn from their mistakes and also apologize for their wrongdoing, particularly when we're having a conversation about intersectionality and race, because, you know, I do feel that people don't feel, and I've had conversations with people, feel comfortable talking about race because they're worried they'll be cancelled. But for us to be able to address those inequalities, to be able to understand what those issues are, we need to take it on head on and have conversation with people that, you know, not necessarily share our views, but help us to understand why they have their views and how we can change the conversation to make them understand that, you know, what they're doing is, you know, essentially quite damaging, and, you know, society should be a place for everybody.
Thank you.
I think that, yeah, I'm gonna stop now, sorry.
So it's okay. I'm just trying to, I know, and I'm conscious of, I'm captivated by all of you. But what I'll do now in the time that we have left, and I'm going to be maybe a quick fire, just one thought, and I'm 30 seconds on which you'd want people to take away from what we talked about today. Because the next minute and a half, so I want to bring back Tonya. So if you could just give me a closing comment about what you want people to take away, top line. If you tweeted it, what would it say? Kolby first.
I come back to the idea that if we want sustainable, durable change, we need to fix our pipelines. We need to see young people of color in positions of leadership at the board, at the elected level, at the leadership of nonprofits. So support organizations, you know, like the Conference on Pacific American Leadership, like the National Society of High School Scholars, like New Voices in Public Policy that are working with corporations and universities to provide networking, fellowships, internships to young people, because diversity is not just about having a more colorful boardroom table, but really it's about bringing the unique perspectives and lived experiences that are going to provide more valuable policy decisions and better policy outcomes.
Excellent. Thank you. Sachi?
What's been really beautiful is seeing mutual racial solidarity. We've seen this historically, we're seeing it today. It is rarely highlighted in the media. How many articles and stories on your newsfeed have you seen about Asian Americans and Black leaders together calling for justice versus a number of violent video clips framed to pit us against each other? I'd say, again, as Abena was saying earlier, it's time to call out, I think, some of these systems that the designers of technology are creating and encouraging just to skew us to trigger more clicks and more likes, to collect more of our data, to create profit and power. It's really important for us to name this collectively together, because data and technology on its own are not neutral.
Thank you. Nadja, and then I'll end with Kendra.
Yeah, I would close off that many people live now in uncertainty and fear because we don't know what's next. It's an unprecedented disruption. So we need more leadership that can articulate the vision, not of what we don't want, but what we do want. How do we get there from here? And really focus on the vision together and have those steps and have those talks, seek to understand before being understood. And I loved Yoshi's your comment. What happened to us so we can heal ourselves and then create better connections. Oprah Winfrey just published a book about it. What happened to you? A lot of behavior is based on our own pain, and we are the only ones who can heal ourselves so we can heal societies and the world.
Thank you. I'm sorry, Abena, then Kendra for a final word, just a quick second.
I'll just say that there's so much we can learn from the past, as what people have said, but I think the pandemic has brought so many people in the community together and has widened what is out there, which is inequalities that really need to be addressed. And this is a time to really start listening and rebuilding and thinking about our future, but not just thinking about the young people, but also older people as well, and making sure that they're more connected. So yeah.
Great. Kendra?
Sure. So one thing that I would say, and I agree with all that everyone has stated, is that in my view, we all have a duty to make a difference. That's something that we all have a duty to do. And I love what Sachi stated about amplifying those conversations where there are commonalities that you may not see those conversations, right? So I think that we should all be very intentional about amplifying those conversations where change is happening.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the panel. Tonya, I'll ask you to come back. Just a reflection if you have one before you have to leave. And then after your voice, I'll turn it over to Reta.
Oh, thank you, Todd. And I just want to thank the panel. You all are brilliant. And it made me think of Darwin's origin of species, where he says it's not the most intellectual of the species that survives. It's not even the strongest that survives, but it's actually the species that thrives is the one that's able to adapt and adjust to the changing environment in which it finds itself. And that's what our world needs. The world is changing and our leaders must change. And I'm so inspired by the leaders on this panel and the work that German Marshall Fund is doing to create the leaders, to center diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think it means that we're going to have to transition our leadership from heroic to host. Hero leaders, they like command and control models. They like to tell people what to do. They believe power needs to shift upwards and concentrate at the top, especially as situations grow complex and risky. And we're in a VUCA world where everything is volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous. So we need host leadership, and host leaders are just that. They're hosts. They invite everyone to be full contributors. We have to create environments that respects and is curious about people's ideas, their skills, and their capabilities. Host leaders provide conditions and processes for people to work together. They know that people are more willing to work for, own, and defend the things that they've played a part in creating. Host leaders learn from multiple experiences, working together to develop measures of progress and having a strong sense of esprit de corps. So I just would say, if we really want to center diversity, inclusion, and equity in global democracies, then we're going to need to center host leadership, who will lead us in the new way of being, governing, and thriving.
Thank you. Reta?
First of all, this has just been a dynamic conversation. And Tonya, we just want to thank you, thank the mayor. Mitch, we really appreciate it. But this panel has just been so dynamic. And when you talk about host leadership, the first person that comes to mind is our GMF president, Dr. Karen Dunphy. I mean, she has been on this journey with us. She has shown the commitment that I think all of us are having here in this conversation. And to be able to say that, one of the things she talks about all the time is about a one GMF. And it's not just about what's happening internally, but it's also about what's happening externally. And so it's through that leadership that, I believe that that Dr. Dunphy has led a real strong commitment across the Atlantic to show us that as an organization, as individuals, as people who are in these types of conversations, that GMF can be a model and an intermediary for discussions on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we hope that you will join us throughout this year-long journey as we examine themes that are going to range everything from talking about the economic opportunities for all, the role of faith-based communities, the inequalities surrounding COVID-19 and healthcare, and of course, pathways to leadership, all going to be viewed from a lens as people who are voices as stakeholders in the US and across the Atlantic, but also viewed from a lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And with that, I just want to thank all of you. You are just this has been the start of a great day and a great journey in this conversation. And we just want to thank our audience for joining us, and we give you back the rest of your day. Thank you. Give you a round of applause. Thank you.